because I think you moved it.
I did.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool.
I'm Dave Chisholm. I think I know pretty much everybody here. So let's get started. When we talk about jazz improvisation, we're basically talking about a continuous process of decision-making and problem-solving in a musical context in real time. It goes something like this. You show up to a gig or a rehearsal or a class or some kind of musical event, and you're expected to improvise. You're either given a shorthand example of what the musical structure is, or you're not, and you're expected to know it. And so this shorthand is basically all of your different possibilities, all of your choices laid out for you. And from these choices, obviously, you have to choose something, and the possibilities are infinite, and this can be really daunting. So for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to talk about navigating through these choices and maybe finding a way that we can talk about these choices that makes it a little bit more efficient. I've decided to divide this navigation into 4 primary categories. They're on the Venn diagram on the handout. We have the yellow is inside horizontal, red is inside vertical, gray is outside vertical, and blue is outside horizontal. The bulk of the lecture recital is going to be me talking through and describing these four approaches to improvisation. In particular, I'm going to be talking about improvising over rhythm changes. For those of you that don't know, rhythm changes is a 32-bar song form that's based on the harmonic structure of George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. Normally it's played in B flat, the form is A-A-B-A, and in the original George Gershwin song, there's a little tag at the end that makes the last A section a little bit longer, but we as jazz musicians generally don't play that section. To be totally exact, I'm going to be drawing my musical examples from this 7-chorus solo on Thelonious Monk's contrafact, Rhythm-a-Ning. It's an amazing solo. It's from a live recording that's on his website, and it's just a phenomenal solo that really solidifies these 4 regions that I'm going to be talking about today. So let's just start by listening to the solo, a recording of the solo. Okay, it's a pretty amazing solo. Every time I hear it, it just makes me excited. So first, before I get into the nitty-gritty of this, I want to give you guys a little bit of background on the inspiration behind this study. 2 years ago, I was taking Bill Dobbins' I Got Rhythm class, a doctoral seminar, just talking about different jazz renditions over these changes, different jazz improvisations over these changes. And I was writing a 40-page paper on this solo. And I was having a little bit of a meltdown at one point trying to talk about a specific section of the solo. And I was meeting with Bill, and he said, "Dave, you're overthinking it. There's really only 4 things you can do when you're playing changes. You can either play in the key, you can play the changes, you can play alternate changes, or you can play outside of the key." And this completely blew my mind. This is all stuff that's just beneath the surface in improvisers' minds, and it really just laid it all out for me, and it really got me thinking and led to a bunch of questions in my head. I asked myself, how would I categorize these different parts of a solo? How subjective is it? Is there any objectivity to this at all? How would someone categorize extended harmony with these criteria? What are the criteria? How can this help my teaching? How can this help my playing? How can this help my practicing? The list goes on and on. It really was inspiring to me, and it led basically to this right now. For me, the end result, if the term end result even works, is a process. And it's a process of categorization and of conversation. And yeah, this process is really what I'm sharing with you today. So let's get started with what appears to be the simplest of these four categories. It's inside horizontal, colored yellow in the solo, IH on the Venn diagram. I say simplest because this approach is characterized by mostly diatonic motion, mostly stepwise linear diatonic motion. In Harrell's solo, when he uses this technique, it tends to come paired with an increased rhythmic activity or a more interesting rhythmic profile from the other categories. If we look in measure 41, there's a nice hemiola figure that comes with this category. And there's another one later on in the solo. And if we look at the very opening even, we see him playing rhythmically with the F, with the fifth of the key. This rhythmic idea on the fifth of the key comes back two more times in the solo in measures 121 and 216. His consistent return to this idea, to this area, is a good example of a trait of inside horizontal playing. Inside horizontal playing becomes a nice safe ground, so to speak. It's a good place to start, and it's a good place for tension release in a solo. It really works in Harrell's solo as such. Now, if you look at the categorization, I do allow for certain amounts of chromaticism within this technique, even though it is largely diatonic. The chromaticism within this technique fits in as ornamental chromaticism. Passing tones, chromatic passing tones, decorations of chord tones by half step. If we look in measure 27, we see Harrell approaching the third of the B flat by half step below. This isn't a functional chromaticism, it's a decorative chromaticism. Also, within this technique, even though we don't necessarily find it in Harrell's solo, I would say bluesy riffing over the A sections of rhythm changes would fit an inside horizontal idea. What it is a flattening out of the A sections in the 4 and 8 bar chunks. Now, when we talk about the bridge of rhythm section within inside horizontally, it gets a little bit problematic. The way I see it, there's two different ways to look at it. Probably the more common way to think of the bridge as being inside horizontal would be to break down each of the four chords of the bridge, D7, G7, C7, and F7, into their own respective modal units. So we would have F mixolydian, or D mixolydian, G mixolydian, and so on. Or we could use the bebop dominant scale with the half step between the flat seventh, with the added half step between the flat seventh and the root. Another way we could look at the bridge of rhythm changes would be to look at it still as being in the key of B flat. Now this is really restrictive and maybe flies in the face of what we practice as jazz musicians because we really want to accentuate the differences when we reach a new section in the form. But this line of thinking can lead to some really interesting thought. If we look at Harrell's solo, he doesn't tend to do this. He usually saves this technique for the second half of the bridge. If we look at measures 53 to 56, we can see him essentially playing in the key of B flat as the chord changes of the bridge return us back to the home harmonic ground. This concept of playing in a key becomes an interesting technique when we encounter more complicated tunes. If we're improvising, say, over the Wayne Shorter song Fee, Fi, Fo, Fum, which is a really chromatic tune with some interesting harmonic twists, if we were to take that tune and only improvise in, say, G Aeolian, G natural minor, it becomes an interesting exercise in trying to make that particular note set fit with the chord changes as they go by, and can provide a great starting point in a solo or a nice place of tension release, as the case may be. Now, as we go through this solo, talking about these different techniques, I want to draw attention to what I'm calling convergence points, or points of convergence. And this is when the melodic material converges on a chord tone at a key structural moment. This normally will occur at the start of an 8-bar phrase, at the end of an 8-bar phrase, at the start of a 4-bar phrase, usually at the beginning or ends of phrases. and usually on a tonic or a dominant chord. These convergence points represent a unification of the horizontal and the vertical concept. We have this horizontal line at the end of a phrase landing on a chord tone at a structural moment. If we look at measure 67, this is a great example of a convergence point. Oftentimes in my analysis, it'll mark a place where the color will change. Okay, the concept of convergence points gains importance the further outside a soloist goes. These are the points when a soloist brings it back inside. Okay. So now I'm going to invite my rhythm section to come up here. I want to demonstrate a couple choruses of playing in this with the inside horizontal technique. What I want you guys to listen for is strong diatonic playing. I want you guys to listen to how I'm going to play the bridge. I'm going to try to play the bridge the first time playing just in the home key of B flat, and the second time I'm going to treat each chord as a modal unit. And listen for these convergence points where the linear activity converges on an acknowledgement of the verticality in the harmony. Okay. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So when I'm playing in this technique, the players that I'm thinking about, and I'm really going to highlight just trumpet players for today, since I play trumpet, I suppose. I'll just stick with trumpet players. I think of 1950s Miles Davis. I think of Chet Baker. Now, again, these are generalizations about these players. I'm sure that any of these players, if I was to tell them, hey, you play like this, they would probably disagree with me. This is just tendencies. These are players historically who maybe we can model our styles after to get these sounds. So now we're going to talk about the second technique. This is the red one, inside vertical. It's called a rhythm handout, IV on the Venn diagram. This is material that directly acknowledges the chord changes, often with tertian figures or chord spellings. This is bebop language. This is the meat and potatoes of what we do. You can spend a lifetime practicing this material and never master it. Sorry, they making faces back there. Okay. Now, the chromaticism that we find in this particular technique tends to be functional chromaticism, acknowledgement of secondary dominance, like the G7 that we find in the A section of rhythm changes. And if we look at measure 131 in the solo, we can see an example of Tom Harrell using this third of the G7 chord. This is in a way, this technique, I hate to draw this distinction, but it's more detail-oriented, those small changes as they go by. Rhythmically, in this style, Tom Harrell tends to be more eighth note oriented. We tend to see long lines of eighth notes. I posit that he's, in the A sections especially, these lines of eighth notes are there to directly acknowledge the 2-beat harmonic rhythm as it goes by. Whereas with the other technique, the inside horizontal, he tends to take these 8-bar sections in as a full chunk of 8 bars that he divides rhythmically up in a different way. That said, jazz masters like Tom Harrell find ways of transcending this eighth notiness that tend to rear their head is when we encounter this style. Okay, so now's the point in my presentation when subjectivity comes into play. This horrible, ugly word when we're trying to analyze music. Subjectivity. It's a terrible, awful thing. When we talk about inside harmony versus outside harmony, that's a subjective call a lot of the time. I think when we're talking about inside horizontal playing, really if a guy plays a B-flat major scale, there's not a whole lot of subjectivity with that. It's going to be inside on this particular tune. Whereas when we're talking about harmony, we're starting to find those cracks along the edges. For example, if we look at Louis Armstrong's reaction to bebop when it first started, he said it sounds like they're playing the wrong chords. And he also said it sounds like Chinese music, the famous anecdote. Now whether this was a commercially driven comment, something where he felt a threat to his domain is one thing, but we can say that him saying this about this music shows that his knowledge of the vocabulary or his cultural knowledge of the vocabulary was in a different place than these bebop players was, and was in a different place than ours is. And that's not to say that me and Paolo might have different set feeling of what inside versus outside is, and that's part of this process. As we get through the outside categories, obviously this subjectivity becomes more a part of it, and it's something that I'll definitely address later on. So now I'm going to demonstrate a few choruses using the inside vertical approach. Listen for bebop language, functional chromaticism, and lines of rolling eighth notes. One, two, one, two, Okay, so when I'm playing in this style, I tend to think of these really towering figures in bebop and hard bop trumpet. I think of Dizzy Gillespie, I think of Clifford Brown, Lee Morgan, Fats Navarro, and Kenny Dorham is a great example of a player who can really navigate the functionality of a chord progression. Sorry to catch my breath a little bit. Okay, this brings us to the third approach. This is outside vertical. And this is when things start to get a little bit weird. It's colored gray on the handout. I ran out of primary colors. So that's life. This is characterized by material largely outside of the home key, but it needs to strongly imply a functional chord progression, right? A functional chord progression that's divergent, that's alternate chord changes, right? When I think of this kind of playing, I tend to think of things like tritone substitution, Coltrane changes, which is a division, an implication of key areas that are major thirds apart. Excuse me. Things like backdoor 2/5s, like on the great Don Byas' version of I Got Rhythm, the duo with Slam Stewart, he has those A sections where he'll start on an F sharp 7 and then work his way back to B flat. Now in Harrell's solo, this is the least frequent technique. The best example of it is measures 111 to 112, where we see this descending, this sequence of descending diminished seventh chords. Now we can see that this is clearly divergent from what's going on in the harmonic structure of the original tune, and yet it clearly has a function as it leads perfectly into the bridge. If we notice also, we see a convergence point in this moment in measure 113. These outside techniques tend to result in by definition, in more dissonance, more tension, and this tension just begs for the resolution that an acknowledgement of the verticality of the inside harmony gives. 113 again is a great example of this. Now, there's two obvious areas in Harrell's solo of tritone substitution. That's measures 35 to 36 and 105 to 106, and the two licks are almost the same, so you don't need to look at both of them. Now, I had a little minor personal crisis in how to categorize these because obviously he's implying tritone substitutions, but when I look at it, I found myself justifying these as expressions of the altered scale. If we look at these notes can all be in the altered scale of each of those altered chords that I have listed above. As a result, I decided to make those part of the in-between area between these two approaches, inside vertical and outside vertical. That said, I'm not sure if I agree with that even now. It's one of these things where it's this kind of liquid, just deciding and talking through it is almost as much as important as what the final resolution is. Again, this is an example of the subjectivity of this approach. Okay, so when I think about this technique, this is the hardest one for me to practice. This really requires a fairly deep knowledge of harmony that as a trumpet player it can be a little hard to visualize some of these patterns that are going by, trying to find new ways to navigate the changes. But the great thing about this outside vertical playing is it's just limited by your own imagination and your own inventiveness. Maybe you go and paint yourself into this harmonic corner and then you have to figure out a clever way back into the home key. This is stuff, when I'm playing it, I want to be able to justify it after the fact. Again, it's the process that counts, because sometimes when I'm practicing this, I play something and I'm just like, wow, that was not happening. But it's good. It's good practice, and it gives it a framework. So I'm going to demonstrate a few choruses using this approach. Maybe we'll play like 3 this time instead of 2, just to give myself an extra chance to get it right. Okay, listen for tritone subs. Listen for Coltrane changes. I'm going to do my best to get through this. 1, 2, 1, 2, players who use this technique, I tend to think of guys, one guy in particular, I think of Woody Shaw. To me, Woody Shaw is the epitome of inside-outside kind of player. He's towing that line between these two worlds, you know. Oftentimes when you analyze his solo lines, they're very justifiable, right? In a functional context. It's not pure chromaticism, there's always a functionality to what he's playing. Also Freddie Hubbard and Booker Little, who could be seen as a forebear to these other players, would be another good example of this technique. And this brings us to the last category. This is outside horizontal. And this is a tricky category, right? It becomes kind of a catch-all. So to break it down further, I've split this into 4 different types. The first one would be sidestepping, right? We see this in Harrell's solo. He presents an idea in the key, and then he moves it up a half step. So all of a sudden it's outside of the key. And then he moves it up another half step, and then back down another half step, and then back down to the home key. We see him doing this in measure 42, measure 107, and also measure 90. The second type that we find is non-functional chromatic patterns. Yeah. Mark Brat's eyebrows just went up when I said that. So this would be patterns that reproduce themselves, say at like major third or minor third, that don't have any sort of textbook functionality, no sort of tonal functionality. We find this in Harrell's solo, 2 good examples in the 6th chorus, measures 168 and 169, and 173 and 175. The first one shows him dividing the octave into minor thirds with this quartal material, and the second one shows him, the descending pattern, shows him dividing the octave into major thirds. These could also be interpreted as maybe 12-tone licks. Licks that use all 12 pitches before they start over, but have a definite pattern to them. The great thing about Harrell's use is he starts them on the root, knowing full and well that they'll return back to the root. And what happens in between is it becomes an angular pattern that he knows is going to return back home. And a third example that we find within the outside horizontal technique, it would be total chromaticism. This is maybe players like Wallace Roney or like Tim Higgins or late 60s Miles Davis. We find a lot of this noodling kind of, I hate to call it noodling, it sounds bad. That's when I learned this, it was called, that's what I was told it was called. When you go down a whole step, up a half step, down a whole step, up a half step, in order to get from point A to point B. The fourth example, and this is a great use of this technique, is the use of exotic scales, right? I hate to use, again, that's another loaded word, exotic, right? But I would say if you were to superimpose an octatonic scale over a large section of a tune, or an augmented scale where it moves by half step and then minor third, half step, minor third, half step, minor third, or even an altered scale could sound very exotic when placed in a situation, and that's what I want to look at. So if we go to the 6th chorus and look at measures 185 to 192, this is my very favorite moment in this entire Tom Harrell solo. If we look at the preceding bridge, over each chord, Tom Harrell is utilizing the altered scale for each of these dominant 7th chords, exclusively the notes of each altered scale in measure 177 in this bridge, right? He gets to the last, he gets to the F7, and he plays the F altered scale over it. And then when he gets to this last A section, he doesn't resolve it. He continues playing this incredibly tense F altered, right? It's outside, it's angular, but in a way, and it is linear, but in a way it still has a function. It becomes this dominant pedal, implied dominant pedal. It's really just an amazing moment. And I also want to point out the end of this lick, right? The end of this lick in measure 191, there's no convergence point. He doesn't bring it back in, right? He leaves it hanging on this incredibly tense note, and then at the start of the next chorus, he comes back home, the sun comes out, everybody's happy. It's a great moment in the solo. It's really just an amazing Amazing moment. Now, when I'm practicing this technique, it's not so much that it's technically hard as much as it is conceptually hard. It's hard not to feel like you're just playing chaos when you're trying to practice linear outside material. I know that when I was younger, like 10 years ago, however old that I was back then, I was really into this outside playing. I loved like Woody Shaw and all these, like the weirder the better was where my taste was at the time. And so I would get on a gig and just, they'd call a tune and I'd be like playing as far outside as I could possibly play. And I would get so lost, right? I would get unbelievably lost and embarrassed, and it's the worst feeling to be on a gig and just lose the form of a tune. And I think if I would have just had this consideration in mind of bringing it back in, bringing it back in a logical way, showcasing the form of a tune, using this inside-outside technique to showcase the form of a tune, I think I would have been much better off in tackling outside playing. And practicing outside playing is a difficult thing. How do you practice playing outside? And so I think this gives it a good package for practicing outside playing. Thinking about convergence points, thinking about still making logical structures within your outside playing. So now we're going to demonstrate a couple choruses with this technique. It's going to get weird in here for a second, and this is for those convergence points too, because I don't want to leave it hanging too much. It's just outside stuff. 1, 2, 1, 2. I tend to think of are, like I said before, Wallace Roney, late 60s Miles, Tim Hagen's, even like 1980s Wynton is a guy that I think of with his Live at the Blues Alley album. I don't know if you guys know that. It's pretty insane. It's pretty crazy. So that covers all 4 of these categories, right? And before I talk about the practical uses of thinking about improvisation this way, which a few of these uses I've hinted at throughout the presentation, I want to talk about a few of the blind spots here. What we're really talking about with this process, with these approaches, is a way of categorizing melody within a harmonic framework. We're really only talking about melody and harmony. There's several things that I didn't talk about here, and I want to just get those out in the open, just so that, just to acknowledge, right? I barely touched on rhythm, right? I talked a little bit about the rhythmic tendencies of the vertical technique versus the horizontal techniques. I didn't talk about motivic development. I didn't talk about motive. I didn't talk about using the melody of a tune as inspiration, which again maybe would fit under motive. I didn't talk about interaction, which is like one of my favorite aspects of playing this music, is the real-time conversational aspect of it. But with this interaction, I think the concept of interaction is embedded inside of thinking about this music this way. If we think about it as a rhythm section player, Mike needs to be able to recognize when a player is playing vertically in the key, vertically out of the key, horizontally in the key, horizontally out of the key, and be able to communicate efficiently on any of this ground, right? And then he needs to be able to hear. He needs to be well versed in it. And me as a horn player, if I'm on a gig or playing with my friends, and I start pushing my boundaries outward, and it's just not coming back to me, I need to do my best to make the situation as productive as possible, to make the music as good as possible, because that's really what it's all about. And so being able to converse in real time and hear these four approaches, I think, is an important aspect of playing this music. Another, it's not so much a blind spot, but another aspect that I wanted to talk about, and this was something that Ben Bishop pointed out to me when I first brought this up to him. Ben is another doctoral student here, and he's not in this room right now. But when I told him about these four approaches, he pointed out that there's a similarity in nomenclature to a section of George Russell's Lydian chromatic concept. And it really freaked me out for a second, knowing that I just completely rehashing somebody else's ideas. That said, I went and checked out George Russell's book and read through it, and these concepts in his book are different from mine. The main difference is really they're embedded within a much larger framework of theory and much larger theoretical framework. Mine is too, but it's built more on inside, outside, talking about defining those and thinking of more like traditional jazz education tools. And that said, this similarity isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you're looking at a solo and you see this section, these A sections are in B flat, and you see a B flat major scale, there's not a whole lot of discerning necessary to say this is a horizontal technique, this is a horizontal expression of an inside idea. In that sense, there's a fair amount of stuff that I've covered that is a little bit no-duh, but I think it needs to be presented in order to build these other ideas on top of it. So what are the practical uses of this idea? To me, the practical uses of thinking about improvisation this way fit both prescriptively and descriptively. When we're analyzing a solo, this gives us a new language with which to describe it. A new language in which a lick is defined more by the why and less by the what. And I think this is an important distinction to make. Oftentimes in jazz education, and when we're learning solos, we tend to do the transcription, get the what under our fingers, and without really acknowledging the why behind it. And this isn't to say that that's not incredibly important in and of itself. Learning the what is a necessary part of playing this music. However, the what is a manifestation, like a real-life, surface-level manifestation of this why. And I feel like this way of looking at it clumps things together by groups of why. Why? What's being manifested here? What's happening here? And as a prescriptive tool, meaning you're sitting in the practice room or you're getting together with your friends and you're playing a tune that you're learning. I know for me, when I'm practicing a tune that I'm learning, I tend to just cover the same ground over and over again. My ideas come out and it tends to be really similar and frustratingly so. And this gives you a prescriptive tool to practice this music, to get out of your comfort zone and maybe find some novelty and get away from habit. The great thing about this, to me, is that it's not too restrictive, but it's also not too open, in the sense that it's not just like, well, play whatever you want, and whatever happens, happens. That, to me, is a little bit too open in an educational sense. On the other hand, it's not like, play this exact solo exactly how it is, and that's going to be your lesson for the day. Now, that's a great thing to do, but on the other hand, in terms of this creative, vital, living art form, that really involves a lot of personal involvement. You want something that gives you a little bit more autonomy. And I feel like looking at music this way, looking at improvisation this way, as a hand-in-hand thing with looking at the what, becomes a really strong tool for finding new material. Also, when we look at the Tom Harrell solo, we see and another great result of thinking about music this way. The big criticism that gets leveled against small group jazz is a formal critique. Small group jazz is this modular, starts over every 32 bars kind of form. And it can be a frustrating thing when you're playing and it seems like it feels like that, starting over every 8 bars, every 32 bars, etc. And when we look at Tom Harrell's solo, we can see that he's really created a larger musical structure. This brilliant 7-chorus solo that never loses your interest, and it maintains unity throughout. And we can definitely look at the colors that I put on it and see where the climax occurs, right? It's in the 6th chorus, towards the end of the 6th chorus. So I want to demonstrate this for you. I'm going to be totally prescriptive. I'm going to play 5 choruses. I'm just going to start inside horizontal, move to inside vertical, outside horizontal, and then return back to inside horizontal, just to kind of show how we can use these techniques to create something, to create a compositional technique in playing over rhythm changes. So, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so before I finish, I'm going to finish by playing the Tom Harrell solo for you guys. But before I finish, I want to bring it back to this issue of subjectivity. I feel like it's something that really flies in the face of music theory. Music theory is this application of the scientific process to music, right? Looking for some kind of overriding science behind music. And when we're talking about science, subjectivity is a definite like no-no. But when I think about this, the subjectivity inherent with these categorizations is really almost the most crucial aspect of it, because it gives us a forum to have conversations about this music. It gives us a chance to debate about what this music means, even if the debate only happens within yourself. It's a search for meaning that you can have with your peers, with your teachers, with yourself. And as one's knowledge of vocabulary grows, these concepts can flip-flop and switch around and everything. These concepts of inside, outside. Is this a vertical? What is Tom Harrell thinking at this particular moment? And these disagreements, I think, are a vital part of moving this forward in the process of discovery that this method of looking at it brings. And to bring it back to the beginning, I talked about improvisation as a process of problem solving and decision making in real time. Now, if we were to take every possible musical event in an improvisation over any like 4-bar span and grid it out much in this manner, really, in reality, what we would get is a spectrum. We wouldn't end up with this perfectly blocked off section, and this blocked off section, and this blocked off section. We would really get a smooth spectrum in which any point would be different from every other point, right? What I mean by this is that if we took every possible lick and put it on this spectrum, according to inside or outside, where it lies, it would be a spectrum, and every lick would only be defined as itself, right? It would be like if we looked at every verb as being only defined as its own meaning, as opposed to being part of this family that we call verbs, right? When we look at music this way, it gives us a kind of syntax that we can define things, we can lump things together, and it gives us power over the theory that's behind them, a power over the why. And this is why I think, that for me, I've been teaching my private students like this ever since Bill threw this at me a few years ago, and it's been something that I've been really thankful for. So yeah, and thanks to Harold for helping me put all this together. It was really great. So I've had a great time putting this together. So yeah, thanks to all you guys for coming out and checking this out. So now we're going to play this Tom Harrell solo, and if there's any questions, we can tackle them after we do this. So wish me luck. There it goes. Oh, that's cool, Mike. Don't worry about it. 1, 2, 1, 2.